Dear Red, you have left me with no choice but to run away from my house and my life. It's simple. Your mini-mags are way too expensive. Here I have left my one and only mini-mag, which holds my final thoughts on the Scarlet-W. Thank you for reading. Brandon Havard. So a little over a year ago, I unboxed the red Scarlet-W. And honestly, it was probably the most memorable day of my career. Oh my God. For me, it was a milestone in terms of my life being a video creator. So, with all that said, I really wanted to take my time in making a part 2 to this red video because I didn't want to rush into it. I wanted to take all of my thoughts over the past year of using this device in the freelance field and for God knows what other projects I've used this on, and make a video to share my whole entire experience with you. Now, a side note, I'm not a numbers person, as you can probably tell. I just know what works and what doesn't work, and what works best for me in my run and gun situations. And honestly, with that said, my first initial thought when thinking about this camera is just how simple it is to use. And I mean, I can't tell you the amount of times that someone's come over to my studio and asked to play around with the camera, and their first initial thoughts are like, oh my God, this is intimidating. It looks like an intimidating camera. It's big, it looks dangerous. But then after a few minutes of actually playing around with it, playing with the software, they're really surprised by how easy to use it is. See, before this camera, I was a Canon user and I thought that was the easiest experience and software to navigate. It pales in comparison to Red software. This is, in my opinion, the cine camera for dummies. Not that you have to be a dummy to use this camera, but you get what I mean. I mean, take Nick, for instance. He's a dummy. He knows how to use this camera. Hey! Hello, you buddy. Now, moving on to the second most widely talked about thing with this camera is probably the price. Now, this is a cinema camera, it's a professional camera. Obviously, it's gonna be expensive. That just sort of goes with the territory. Now, what a lot of people don't realize, and what's almost deceptive on the Red online site, is that, yes, you can buy the brain, but that won't allow you to do anything unless you buy a whole bunch of other things to actually make it work. Now, to give you an idea of all the parts that are on my camera and my whole entire setup, basically my brain, which is the Scarlet-W, it's about $12,500. Now that's just the core of the situation. It's basically the computer. It holds your sensor. Basically, you just put things onto that to make it operate. And on top of the brain is the 7-inch touchscreen, which costs you about $2,750. This allows you to see what you're actually shooting, as well as operate the software on the camera. It's kind of necessary. Now, as a side note, a lot of this stuff is proprietary too, especially the screens to make the software work. You can't really go third party with the majority of these parts. Now, as for my handle situation, I have the OUTRIGGER handle, which costs about $550, and that has a record button on the side as well as a grip. And that part isn't totally necessary. Basically, I just like to use it for extra stability if I have the camera off of the tripod. And on top of that is yet another handle, which costs you about $150. That's definitely on the cheaper side of this stuff. And then if you want to plug in I/O like HDMI and direct power, you have to buy the base expander, which is about $1,750. That's expensive. And on top of that base expander is the V-Lock battery module that allows you to slot in your red bricks for direct power when you're on the go. Then for each red brick, it's about $450. Then to be able to slot on your lenses, you have to buy a mount for the front of your brain. That costs about $700. I went for the EF mount since I have majority Canon lenses. And then in addition to all of this, I use a low light OLPF inside the camera. That's about $295. And now let's talk about media. Now, if you're confused by what media means, essentially some cameras use SD cards, some cameras use CFast cards, and Red uses mini-mags. Now, from what I hear, mini-mags are essentially souped up Samsung SSDs that have a nice color on them. If you buy the more expensive ones, you just get black if you buy the cheaper ones. But point is, all of them are basically the price of your firstborn. Now, if we're talking about the one that I bought, which is the 480 gigabyte mini mag, that sets you back about $1,850. $1,850 for a glorified SD card. So, needless to say, this is a very expensive camera. I mean, it's a professional cinema camera, even if we're talking about ARRI Alexa Mini, which is comparable in terms of the price. The ARRI Alexa Mini is just a bit more. But essentially, we're talking about packages that are made for people that take this industry very seriously and that more often than not do this stuff for a living. But enough about price. Let's talk about the things that make this camera really exceptional and, in my opinion, worth the hefty price tag. And first up is dynamic range. Now, if you're questioning what dynamic range is, basically it's the range in between the highlights and the shadows, all of that information in between. Now with this camera, especially in post when you're color grading and adding LUTs, you can pull a lot of information out of the really dark shadows and the really bright highlights. But beyond just post-production and color grading, I want to talk about just the overall look that you get through your monitor or your 1700 whatever it is touchscreen on top of your camera. The look that you get is purely incredible. You see, in my opinion, it all comes down to one word, and that's depth. Depth in the shadows, depth in the highlights. I guess you could say overall, it's just a very rich image. How you doing, Rich? The number two is the flexibility that you get within the software for your aspect ratio, your resolution, as well as your frame rate. Now, in terms of aspect ratio, this is where you get a lot of flexibility. You can shoot widescreen, 2:1, whatever you're really feeling. But basically being able to see how you're shooting within the aspect ratio in terms of framing, it's just a true unspoken hero. Now, basically my most used frame rates is of course 24 for this type of thing, A-roll, as well as 48 if I want to go a little bit slower with a more cinematic style. And finally 120, which is a very slow motion that allows for some pretty epic shots. Now basically why I bring up resolution is with 120, you have to bring it down to 4K, which I know seems like such a travesty, but 4K allows for you to shoot 120. But basically with that said, you have a ton of options with frame rate if you just go down slightly with resolution. And now the other thing that really sticks out to me when I think about this camera is the ability to shoot in RAW. So in short, this allows you to change a lot of pivotal properties in post with your image, like Kelvin or your color profile or even contrast and saturation. So having that extra flexibility in post really allows you to hone in on the final look for your project. Now, as I've said before, and I'm sure I'll probably say it again, this is a cinema camera. And basically what that means is it's kind of meant for a team to use. It's not necessarily for a one-person operation. For instance, there's no autofocus. It's purely manual focus. It's a manual camera. There's kind of a form of autofocus, but it's not worth your time. And the other thing is that modularity is there for a reason. It's supposed to be rigged up and rigged down depending on your style of shoot. This rig itself is very bare bones compared to a lot of rigs that I've seen. But going deeper into that, as much as this camera is big, it's meant to be extremely versatile in what kind of rigs you decide to put it in. So, you know, whether you're balancing it on a gimbal like a Movi or a Ronin, or you're putting it on a robot like the Mia or Kira, or you're throwing it on a tripod or a slider, basically it's meant to be as versatile as possible. Basically, more often than not, you're probably gonna see a whole bunch of different wires hanging off this thing with maybe a fizz system to manually control your focus. My point is, my rig is extremely small, extremely bare bones, where in contrast, you're more often than not gonna see this thing fully rigged out and look frankly terrifying. But the point in saying all of this is it's about rigging it out to your personal preference, making it work for you in your shooting style. So is this the perfect camera? No, it is not the perfect camera. Honestly, no camera is perfect. But for me and my use case and my line of work, this is the closest I've ever been. But basically, with all of this information spewed out at you, the thing that I am left saying is it's all about affording this ecosystem. It's an incredibly expensive ecosystem, and unfortunately, a lot of it is proprietary, as I said before. But at the end of the day, I'm just so thankful to say that this camera, over the past year of using it, has not proven me wrong. But basically, those are the spark notes of my thoughts on this camera. If we talked about everything, we'd probably be here for days. And look, it's already dark out. That's how long I've been talking to this camera. But I hope you enjoyed this slightly different type of video. It's definitely less general consumer oriented, but I wanted to talk about one of my favorite pieces of technology, the red Scarlet-W. Thank you all for watching. Stay tuned and take it easy. Bye.